All right. Greetings once again, and welcome to part number 5, which I believe is possibly going to be our concluding part of this Jewish war series. So far, we have come to the place where the war has started in earnest. The whole of Galilee and northern Israel is now in the hands of the Romans under Vespasian. Jerusalem is under the tenuous and very shaky leadership of the zealots and the priests and the Sicarii. There is much civil war going on amongst the Jews. And we have also seen that the mystery of lawlessness has taken hold of the temple. The zealots have attacked the temple complex. They have taken it into their own hands. They have installed their own high priest, Pharnias. I erroneously said in the last section that Ananas, Ben Ananas, the high priest, has already been killed. That is actually not accurate. I'm going to correct that now. He is killed a little bit later, but now we know that because the temple is in the hands of the very lawless, abominable, wicked men called the Zealots, and they have installed their own high priest. Very shortly, the other true high priest is going to be killed. So let's take up from there and let's see if we can finish this series. So, the Jewish war series, Ananas the high priest versus the zealots, and the further betrayal by John of Gishala, whom we met a couple series ago. Now, after the zealots had seized the control of the temple complex and had thrown out all the established priests, those who had been restraining them, the high priest Ananas made one last effort to regain control of the city and crush the zealot revolutionaries. So notice, war is going on amongst the Jews while they are also being attacked by the Romans. I mean, how can you win such a war? The fact was that the majority of the citizens in Jerusalem, although they had no love for Rome, quickly saw that the zealot revolutionaries were proving themselves to be more vicious and dangerous than Roman rule had been. That's a very important point. That the revolutionaries, the zealots, the rebel leaders were more vicious than the Roman occupiers. Now, I know some of you feel like that about your own countries. You feel that some of your leaders are more vicious than foreign occupiers. So this is how they were feeling. The zealots had done what the more unscrupulous revolutionists have done throughout history. They took advantage of a less than desirable situation. That is, being under Roman rule, specifically the horrible governorship of Florus, and they had proceeded to antagonize and agitate the situation, slowly working the populace into a riotous frenzy, and thus making it possible to manipulate the masses towards their own ends. How very common this is. The people of Jerusalem saw that they essentially had been played and manipulated by the zealot revolutionaries in order to spark the revolt against Rome, and they were now at the mercy of bloodthirsty killers who had no mercy to show. And Ananas clearly saw that if they didn't rise up against the zealots, soon all hope would be lost, and they would find themselves essentially prisoners in Jerusalem with the ravenous zealots as their tormentors within the city and the Roman legions besieging them from without. The appeal of Ananas. And so the high priest Ananas, along with Gorion ben Josephus, Simon ben Gamaliel, as well as fellow high priest Jesus ben Gamalas and Ananas ben Ananas, met with the populace at a place within the city far removed from the temple complex. And he made his appeal. I quote, "It would have been better." Now, I want you, dear friends, let me pause here just so that we can all be on one place. Thank you so much, Brother Nathan. Brother Nathan says he will be here till 4. By the way, Nathan, can you also give us the link to that animated series again on this particular session, so that those who want to watch the animated series of the Jewish War can also watch it from the link you gave us before. I think that would be very good here also. So here it is. This is what I want you to notice. I want you to pay attention to the choice of words that Ananias is going to use when he describes the zealots. And I want you to think of the choice of words that John the Revelator and Paul and Peter use when they describe their enemies. I want you to pay attention to that. Okay, so here we go. So this is the appeal of Ananias. So it would have been better for me to have died before I have seen the house of God, that is the temple, filled up with so many abominations. So this is what the high priest of Israel is declaring in 68 AD about what is happening at the temple. He says, I would rather have died than to have seen the temple of God filled up with so many abominations, or our sacred places that should never have been trampled upon. So notice the words that are being used here. Revelation 11 tells us that the outer court is given over to the Gentiles to trample the holy city. It should never have been trampled upon in such a blasphemous manner. Blasphemy. Filled with the feet of blood-shedding villains. We thought that Roman rule was oppressive. Yet now, in 68 AD, that is, under these zealots, we are under a much greater tyranny than Rome ever displayed. Why are we taking it? Why aren't we rising up to expel these seditious kittens? Obviously, I misread it. They are not kittens. They are not Barbies. They are seditious what? B-E-S-T-S. Have you ever heard of such a word in the Bible? Have you ever heard of the abyss? This is what the high priest of Israel, who was not a Christian, who was not trying to fulfill the words of John or of Daniel or of Paul or of Peter, but he says that these guys who are now ruling us, 2 years before, 1.5 years before the temple is destroyed, they are called seditious beasts. I showed you in Revelation 13 how we have 2 beasts. Why are we taking it? Why aren't we rising up to expel these seditious beasts? We made the huge mistake of overlooking them and not taking them seriously when they were but a few in number. And now they have been able to gain strength, seize control of the house of God, and take over the entire city. Are you going to stand for this? Are you going to just stand idle and let your sanctuary be trampled? Rise up, and turn upon these beasts that profane the temple of our God and beat you down into the dust. We can bear under submission to foreigners, for it seems that fortune has already doomed us to it. It has been this way for the past 600 years. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and now Rome. I don't know why, but God has ordained it. But we are called to submit to the wicked people of our own nation? No. To submit to such evil is too unmanly, too docile, too shameful, especially when we know all this happened because we allowed it to happen. Man, what a speech. Those wicked men who are trampling upon your liberties and profaning the house of God deserve to be destroyed. If we rise up to fight them, they will cower like the dogs they are. and we will be able to tame them because they are beasts, of course. But even if we fail, to rise up and fight them is still the right thing to do. If the danger is too great and we perish, it would be better to die before the holy gates of God's house, knowing that we have given our lives for the sake of our children, for the sake of our wives, for the sake of God Himself, and for the sake of the sanctuary. So that is the appeal of Ananias, the high priest. He's telling the people of Jerusalem in 68 AD, we need to rise up against the beasts who are now tormenting us, ruling us over us with abominations, making the house of God filthy with bloodshed. We need to rise up against them. Now, watch this. Revelation chapter number 11. What happens in Jerusalem in Revelation 11? And yet, by the way, this is another proof that Revelation was written before 70 AD. Look at what happens in Revelation 11, the two witnesses. Then I, John, was given a rod, a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours out from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. They, the two witnesses, have the power to shut up the sky, and so that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague so as often as they desire. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. So where will the bodies of the two witnesses lay? In Jerusalem. So if the bodies of the two witnesses lay dead in Jerusalem, what does that tell you about the beast? And this is, by the way, this is the very first time in the Revelation that the beast is mentioned. Where is the beast located? Where is the beast operating from in Revelation? This is the very first mention of the beast in the book of Revelation. So the beast kills the two witnesses in Jerusalem. The beast is in Jerusalem. Ananias ben Ananias, or Ananias the high priest, has just told you the beast is the zealots. They are in Jerusalem. They have taken over Jerusalem. They have taken over the temple. They are killing us. We need to rise up against these beasts. We need to tame them. There is your beast in Revelation 11. There is your temple in Revelation 11. Now remember that Josephus, as far as we know, was not writing in response to the book of Revelation. We are not even aware that he ever read it. Let's go back to our war series here. So Ananias has given his very rousing speech. Inevitably, there were informants who alerted the zealots regarding Ananias' speech. Ananias, now you see what Ananias is doing, right? Ananias is trying to restrain the mystery of lawlessness. Ananias is trying to restrain the men of lawlessness. He's trying to restrain the zealots, the men of lawlessness. Ananias' plan entailed having the people come into the temple complex to take part in the regular sacrifices and offerings made daily in the temple, because they were still going on for the Jews. Remember, the only sacrifices that were stopped are the ones for foreigners. So he was going to send people pretending they were going to do their regular sacrifices, but then they were going to launch a surprise attack on the zealots and hopefully retake the temple and drive the zealots out of the city. Yet, since the zealots had been informed of Ananas's plan, they were ready. And in fact, they proceeded to attack the crowds in the temple before they were able to launch what they thought would be a surprise attack on the zealots. Just need to send these guys 1 second. Here we go. Just a quick email here, guys. 1 second. Just realized I needed to. All right. So the plan of Ananas fails. As the zealots began to attack the crowds, Ananas tried to mobilize his forces on the spot. The numbers vastly favored the people, but it was the zealots who had access to more weapons, and there were heavy casualties on Ananas's side. Nevertheless, the people were able to press forward and force the zealots to retreat back within the inner court of the temple, at which time they shut the gates. Once Ananas's people had successfully taken control of the outer courts, he quickly set guards all around the inner court. And when he and the other leaders among the people strategized what to do next. John of Gischala, remember him, surprisingly had not sided with the more radical zealots. Of course, the reason probably had more to do with the fact that he had been unable to secure a position of power among the zealots than that he had actually opposed their revolutionary ambitions. He wanted to be in charge, and so he had to find a way to get in charge. And that meant playing both sides, one against the other. Ever since he had come to Jerusalem, though, Ananas had been very suspicious of John. After all, he came into Jerusalem calling for war, and yet here he was with Ananas, supposedly standing against the revolutionaries. And so Ananas and his people confronted John with their suspicions and required him to take an oath of allegiance before God before they were to trust him. And to this, he quickly agreed. For some reason, Ananas became so convinced of John's loyalty to the people that he chose John to be his spokesman to the zealots. Wow. He sent John into the inner court to try and get the zealots to agree to lay down their arms and to agree to leave the city. Yet, once inside the temple, instead of laying out Ananas's offer, John proceeded to lie to the zealots by telling them that Ananas had already sent for the Romans to come and retake the city. Such a suggestion infuriated the zealots. And then John, in an attempt to win them over and have them look upon him as their leader, told them that if some of them snuck out of the city, they could send word to the Idumeans, the Edomites, and tell them what Ananas was planning. Tell them that Ananas was planning to betray Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans and convince the Idumeans to liberate Jerusalem from the Roman sympathizers. The zealots really had no other choice, so they listened to John's advice and they sent for the Idumeans. Ananas had been so close to avert disaster for Jerusalem. Ananas had been so close to restrain the men of lawlessness. Yet, it was all come to nothing. It all came to naught. Okay, so he fails in his attempt. So let's go to the next part. Now let's see what the Idumeans are going to do in this war and how they are going to take it to its utter destruction. So we come to the issue of the Idumeans. In actuality, Eleazar ben Simon and Zacharias ben Phalek, two of the zealot leaders who, along with the rest of the zealots who were trapped in the temple, smuggled out a letter to the Idumeans. In it, they told the Idumeans in the south that Ananas had betrayed Jerusalem and the Jews. Now remember, Ananias has not betrayed Jerusalem and the Jews. These are all lies. Be destroyed. So that he had already sent word to Vespasian, the Roman general, and that the Romans to tell them that he was prepared to hand over the city to them, and that he had essentially imprisoned the zealots within the temple. The zealots therefore appealed to the Idumeans that if they wanted to liberate Jerusalem, they had to come quickly. And so the Idumeans assembled 20,000 troops under the leadership of John and Jacob ben Soras and Simon ben Cathlas and Phineas ben Clusathas. When Ananias got word that an army of Idumeans was approaching the city, he ordered that the gates be shut until he could ascertain what their motive was. Needless to say, the Idumeans were not happy to find the gates shut. It only deepened their suspicions of Ananias. And so, when Ananias sent Jesus, one of his most trusted priests, essentially the second in command, to the wall to speak to the Idumeans, tensions and suspicions were already running high. Nevertheless, Jesus was going to try and make his appeal. Of course, Jesus was a common name in the first century in Israel, just as it is a common name in Mexico. Speaking to the Idumeans from the wall, Jesus began, "O Idumeans, I know you are angry that the gates are shut, but we must protect this city, and therefore we must first ascertain what your intentions are. You are clearly arrayed for war, and you have obviously been alerted to the situation here in Jerusalem. But you must know that these zealots who have appealed to you are not freedom fighters. They are the vilest of men who have already committed countless atrocities within the walls. They are the ones who forcibly took over the temple and banished the rightful priests of the sanctuary. And they are the ones who profaned its courts with their drunkenness and eating unclean food within its gates. Are you really going to come to their aid? I know they have accused Ananias of sending for the Romans, but why on earth would we now sell ourselves to the Romans? Yet, before the revolt began, we did not think it wise to rebel. But the fact is, revolt has erupted throughout the land, and already the Romans have retaken Galilee. There is simply no going back to the way things were before. Yes, back before, we desired peace before death, but now we would rather die with our honorable reputations than invite the Romans back voluntarily, because their slaves live in captivity, or voluntarily become their slaves and live in captivity under them. So please join us against those murderous tyrants who profane the house of God. Help us save Jerusalem. They have tortured some of the leading, most honorable men of the city, and they have done so without cause in the marketplaces and in the plazas. If you lay down your arms, we will let a contingent of you come into the city and see for yourselves the atrocities that the zealots have committed. I am confident that then you will see their treachery and side with us. But if you refuse to accept this offer, then please just leave this place." Simon ben Cathlas responds. Simon ben Cathlas, one of the leaders of the Idumeans, then shouted back a reply to Jesus. "You cannot fool us. We know that the true patriots of liberty are now trapped within the city, within the temple itself. The very fact that you have shut the gate reveals to us that you cannot be trusted. You've locked us out of the holy city, and there is no doubt in our minds that you already sent for the Romans. If we were to come inside the city, the atrocities that you show us and that you attribute to the freedom fighters of Judea will have been your own. Do you think we are so foolish to lay down our arms and enter the city so that you can do to us the very things that you've done to them? You call them tyrants and accuse them of untold atrocities. You say they murdered the leading men of the city in cold blood. We know the truth. You are the tyrants. Those men the zealots killed were the true terrorizers of this nation, bent on betraying our people. No, we will never believe your lies." After numerous appeals, Jesus finally left the wall, despondent. There was nothing more he could say to convince the Idumeans of the crimes of the zealots. The gates remained shut, and the Idumeans remained encamped outside the city. That very night, a heavy rainstorm swept through the countryside. Many in the city were convinced that the heavy thunder and lightning could be nothing but a bad omen of coming disaster and destruction. Now, notice the words here. There's a heavy thunderstorm, there's lightning, there's thunder, there's signs in the heavens above. They think that this is supernatural. The rain was so heavy that Ananias gave the temple guards leave to seek shelter and get some rest. Yet that decision gave the zealots the opening they needed. In the midst of the rainstorm, a small band of zealots made their way to the most remote part of the gate of the temple and proceeded to cut the bars of the gate. The thunder and lightning drowned out any noise of the cutting of the bars. Then they secretly made their way to the city walls, and finding another remote gate, they successfully cut the bars to those gates as well and quickly ran out to the Idumean camp just outside the city walls. And so, in the middle of the night, in the midst of the ominous storm, the Idumeans snuck into the city and began to unleash a storm of their own. Next part coming up, the onslaught of the Idumeans. The onslaught of the Idumeans, which is part number 11. Now, before I begin the onslaught of the Idumeans, I want to show you something. So you see how so far you have three distinct groups of Israelites that are fighting for the control of Jerusalem. You have the zealots, you have the priests and the people, and you have the Idumeans, which are outsiders. They are from the south of Israel. They are Edomites. They are of the family of Herod. So you have three groups fighting for the control of Jerusalem. Now, I want you to see how the prophecy of John lays out this three-part division of the city. We are still in Revelation 11. It says that the two witnesses are killed in Jerusalem. For 3.5 days, continuing from verse 9, some of the peoples and of the tribes and the language and nations will gaze at the dead bodies and refuse for them to be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange gifts, because these two prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. Now, since I'm not focusing on trying to exegete this passage, don't ask me to explain every one of these verses, but there's something I want you to see. But after 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. Verse 13. And at that hour, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in an earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second war has passed. Behold, the third war is soon to come. Then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ or the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever." And the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, "We give thanks to you, O Lord God Almighty, who was, who is, who was. For you have taken your great power, and you have begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath has come. For the time for the dead to be judged, and for the rewarding of your saints, the prophets, and your servants, those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes, lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. You see how he ends? There were flashes of lightnings, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. Now, let's compare this with what Josephus reports. Remember, Josephus is not reporting from Revelation. He's just reporting from a historical point of view, what he saw. So, the Jewish war, the Idumeans, and the Zealots' reign of terror in Jerusalem. With the Idumeans now in the city, they and the Zealots began to unleash a reign of terror in Jerusalem. The first order of business for the Idumeans was to go directly to the temple and slaughter the temple guards and free the Zealots who had been holed up in the temple. The fighting was vicious, and by the morning there were 8,500 dead bodies strewn across the temple courts. It's interesting that Revelation says 7,000 were killed. Josephus says 8,500. Of course, Revelation is using symbolic numbers. So it was a complete victory. So 8,500 dead bodies were laying in the temple courts, not in some battlefield, in the courts of the temple of God, in the courts of holiness, were 8,500 dead bodies strewn across the temple courts, which were now stained with the blood of the victims. After their work in the temple, the Idumeans then proceeded to plunder the houses throughout the city, killing the inhabitants and taking any and all supplies they wanted. In addition, they purposely searched for Ananias and Jesus, the two priests who headed the resistance to the Zealots. When they found them, the Idumeans sarcastically thanked Ananias for his hospitality and Jesus for his wonderful speech on the wall, and then killed them both. Did you catch it? We have two witnesses standing on the wall, making a defense for the temple of God. They are the two witnesses that are killed the same morning that the Idumeans have killed 8,500 people in the temple complex. Just a thought. We're not saying it's conclusive, just a thought. It is at this point that it is necessary to actually quote Josephus's take on this. Quote, the death of Ananias was the beginning of the destruction of the city. From this very day may be dated the overthrow of her wall and the ruin of her affairs, whereon they say their high priest, the procurer of their preservation, slain in the midst of the city. Actually, this is they saw. So let me read that again. The death of Ananias, the high priest, was the beginning of the destruction of the city. From this very day may be dated the overthrow of her wall and the ruin of her affairs, whereon they saw their high priest, the procurer of their preservation, slain in the midst of the city. I cannot but think that it was because God doomed this city to destruction as a polluted city and was resolved to purge his sanctuary by fire that he cut off these, their great defenders and well-wishers, while those that a little before had worn the sacred garments and had presided over the public worship and had been esteemed venerable by those that dwelt on the whole habitable earth, when they came into our city, were cast out naked and sent to be the food of dogs and wild beasts. End of quote. The rest of the noblemen of the city were bound and put in prison, And when they refused to swear their allegiance to the zealots, they were brutally tortured and killed. Upon seeing those horrors, the mass of the citizens retreated to their houses, mourned in secret, and avoided going outside at all costs. The city soon became like a ghost town. Let's go back to Revelation. The city soon became like a ghost town. Watch what Revelation 18 tells us about the city called Mystery Babylon. It says, after this I saw another angel coming down from heaven having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. Let me just go that far. This is what John reports in his revelation. This is what Josephus says. The city soon became like a ghost town, like a haunted place. That did not deter the zealots, though. With the Idumeans looking on in an attempt to give their slaughters a ring of legitimacy, the zealots forced 70 respected men in the city to be the jury in fake tribunals. They brought in front of this tribunal a man named Zacharias ben Baruch. They put him on trial and accused him of betraying the city and having sent for Vespasian. When Zacharias was ordered to publicly answer the charges, he instead openly laughed at the accusation. He proceeded to bring his own accusations against the zealots and Idumeans, detailing the numerous atrocities and sins they had committed in the city. The verdict came back, not guilty. The respected men refused to be complicit in the charade. The zealots, though, were enraged at being shown up. And so, in disregard of the verdict, they descended upon Zacharias and slew him in front of the tribunal in the temple itself. Then they seized the 70 men, they severely beat them and sent them back to their homes in order to send a message to the rest of the citizens of Jerusalem that the same thing would happen to them if they crossed the zealots. Now, I want you to see this guy. His name is Zacharias, son of Baruch. Let's read that part again. I had never seen this part before. I've read this thing, I'd never caught it, but I just caught it. This did not deter the zealots, though. With the Idumeans looking on, in an attempt to give their slaughters a ring of legitimacy, the zealots forced 70 respected men to be a fake tribunal. They brought to this tribunal a man named Zacharias, son of Baruch. They tried him. They found him not guilty. They killed him. Now, why did that just stand out to me? And I don't know if it is accurate, but it's just something that I remember from Matthew. You know how you're reminded something? Matthew 23. Matthew chapter number 23. What Jesus says. This is so strange, man. I'm goosebumps over here. I'm like, wow. How did I miss this before? Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and you decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify. Some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Barachiah. And Barachiah, of course, is an iteration of the name Baruch, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. Sherry, wow, wow is an understatement. That is an understatement. Because look at what Josephus reports happened in front of the temple. My God. Wow. The zealots, the beasts, my God, were enraged at being shown up. So in disregard of the verdict, they descended upon Zacharias, the son of Barachias, and they slew him in front of the tribunal in the temple itself. Then they seized the 70 men, they beat them severely, and then sent them back to their homes in order to send a message to the rest of the citizens of Jerusalem that the same thing would happen to them if they crossed the zealots. By this time, upon seeing the zealots' complete disregard for the sanctity of the temple and the clear farce of the fake tribunals, the Idumeans began to realize that Ananias and Jesus were actually telling the truth about the zealots, and that they had actually come to the city and freed truly wicked and evil men. And so the Idumeans repented of what they had done, and they abruptly left the city. Before they left, however, they freed their 2,000 Jewish prisoners, and the 2,000 fled the city. And they went out to Simon ben Gioras, the Jewish revolutionary who had led the counterattack against Cestius, for help. Although the Idumeans' departure surprised everyone, it actually emboldened the zealots even further to commit more atrocities. They proceeded to hunt down every leading man in the city they could find. Meanwhile, while all this was happening in Jerusalem, Vespasian and his forces sat tight in Galilee. Some of his generals urged him to march into Judea and take Jerusalem immediately, but he refused, telling them that if they were to advance to Jerusalem at this point, the chances were that the warring factions of the revolutionaries would unite against them. But instead, if the Romans held back, they would be able to simply let the warring factions tear each other apart. And what a war strategist. And so Vespasian continued to let the zealots wreak their own destruction. Let me just, I'm not going to take you there, but in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel says that the end of the sanctuary would be that the people of the prince who was to come were going to themselves destroy the sanctuary and the city. Now, you have been taught often by futurists and dispensationalists and many prophecy teachers that the people of the prince to come were the Romans. But in fact, as you can see, the people of the prince to come are Jews, because the prince to come is Jesus. The Jews are 100% responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem. Can you see that? The Romans were simply the battle axe of God. They were simply the equipment that God used. But who is responsible? Who is guilty of destroying Jerusalem? The Jews, the people of the prince to come. They are the destroyers that were to be destroyed. They are the desolators that were to be destroyed. Can you see this? The Romans were not in Jerusalem for 3.5 years. The Bible calls for the beast to be in Jerusalem for 42 months. The Bible calls for the beast to be operating with impunity, or without, I can't remember which one it is, without any regard for human life. The beast was to destroy the saints of God inside Jerusalem for 1260 days. The Romans did not arrive in Jerusalem until the last 5 months. The beast is not the Romans. Hopefully, this is showing up that even the leaders of the Jews were themselves calling the zealots the beasts. Continuing. The state of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, although Vespasian's decision certainly made sense, it certainly was not good news for the masses of people in Jerusalem who were essentially being held hostage by the zealots. Day after day, Jews were attempting to escape from the city, but the zealots had posted guards at every passage out of the city. Although some Jews did manage to escape, some of the wealthier Jews were able to bribe the guards to let them escape. Most were killed by the zealots, who simply dragged their bodies to line up the roads outside the city. It is at this point that a direct quote by Josephus is again in order. Quote, "These men trampled upon all the laws of men, and they laughed at the laws of God." These men trampled upon all the laws of men, and they laughed at the laws of God. And as for the oracles of the prophets, they ridiculed them as the tricks of a juggler. Before I continue, I have to show you something. They laughed at the laws of God. They laughed at the laws of men. Have you ever heard such a thing in the Bible in a prophetic word? Well, let me show it to you, just in case you may not be familiar with it. We read it a little bit earlier today. 2 Thessalonians chapter number 2. 2 Thessalonians. So you see, people say, I tell people, Jesus came back the second time. Well, that would have been recorded. Here we have a direct record, as if Josephus is reading 2 Thessalonians chapter number 2. Look at what Josephus reports about the men of lawlessness. He says, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first. And then, after the rebellion, comes the men of lawlessness, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God, small g, and every object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." Let me read that again. The man of lawlessness is the son of destruction. He opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. What does Josephus say? Look, these are the words of Josephus. "These men trampled upon all the laws of men, and they laughed at the laws of God." This is a direct quote. "And as for the oracles of the prophets, they ridiculed them as tricks of a juggler. There was a certain ancient oracle of these men, that the city should be taken and the sanctuary burnt by right of war, when a sedition should invade the Jews, and their own hand should pollute the temple of God." There was a certain oracle, there was a certain prophecy of those men, that the city should be taken and the sanctuary burnt by right of war, when a sedition should invade the Jews, and their own hand should pollute the temple of God. Now, whatever is Josephus talking about? Which is this ancient oracle which had predicted that at some point there was going to be a sedition, an apostasy amongst the Jews that was going to result in the burning of the city and the sanctuary. Which could this oracle be that Josephus is attributing to the activities that happen in Jerusalem? Anybody care to venture? Daniel chapter 9. Josephus is quoting Daniel chapter 9 verbatim. He's saying that's what these men were. He's not saying this is what these men were kind of like. He's saying this is the fulfillment of this prophecy that I'm about to show you by Daniel, a very famous and popular prophecy. Daniel 9:27. Daniel 9:27. And this is what it says in Daniel 9:27. In fact, let us begin in 26. And after 62 weeks, an anointed one, Jesus, shall be cut off and shall appear to have accomplished nothing. I'm kind of paraphrasing it because that's the actual meaning. And the people, now watch this, and the people of the prince, Jesus, who is to come in the future, the Messiah, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Josephus is quoting this directly. Let me show it to you again. There was a certain oracle of those men that the city should be taken and the sanctuary burnt by right of war when a sedition should invade the Jews and their own hand should pollute the temple of God. This is how Josephus interpreted Daniel 9. How does your denomination interpret Daniel 9? Your denomination tells you, most of you, that the people of the prince who is to come are the Romans. Josephus tells you, no, the people of the prince to come are the Jews. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. That's what Josephus is quoting. Desolations are decreed. And he, the prince that is to come, Jesus, he will make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. This is the ministry of Jesus. From the time Jesus was baptized to the time that his disciples were expelled out of Jerusalem. 7 years exactly. This is the 70th week of Daniel. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half the week, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, because he becomes the perfect sacrifice. And on the wing of abominations shall come one, the man of lawlessness, who makes desolate. And until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Who is the desolator? Is not an individual man. It is a company of men acting as one man, the zealots. Let's continue to see them and how Josephus talks about them. Again, I will read it as we continue. Quote, there was a certain ancient oracle and a certain ancient prophecy of these men, that the city should be taken and the sanctuary burnt by right of war when a sedition should invade the Jews and their own hand should pollute the temple of God. Here is a personal note of Joel Edmond. He says, I find this last quote interesting. What prophecy was Josephus talking about? I do know, though, as we read in the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21, that Jesus did prophesy that the temple would be destroyed in language rather similar to this. Amen. Now, what I would like to do, I would like to continue on to the next one, even though we are at the 52nd minute, because I believe that this next one is probably going to be, well, no, actually, let's just finish there so that it's not too long. I was tempted there for a moment to continue. Let's just finish there for today, at least for this session. So let's summarize where we have reached. So far, we are in the 5th part of the Jewish war series. At the beginning, Florus, the wicked governor, procurator, the Roman procurator of Judea, had instigated the Jews to rebel, which of course they were fulfilling the purpose of God. And of course, this caused the Jews to begin to fight back. And when they began to fight back, then civil war broke out. Not only amongst the Jews, but amongst the Jews and the Gentiles of Jerusalem and of Galilee. We saw Josephus being sent over to Jotapata, to Galilee area to secure it, but he fails. And eventually, the Romans have secured the northern part of Israel, Samaria and Galilee. And now we have seen that in the city of Jerusalem, the zealots have taken full control and they have manifested their beastly characteristics. They have taken control of the temple complex. They are liars. They are deceivers. They are murderers. They are beasts. And they have killed the high priest Ananus and his associate Jesus. Interesting, the names. And now the city is ripe for final destruction. The abomination of desolation is now operating full force. And so the next time that we will meet, we will now begin to come into the final stages of the fulfillment of Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13, the book of Revelation, Daniel 9, and Daniel 12, amongst many other scriptures that we have even looked at, like Joel chapter 2. So please, I urge you, if you have not yet believed it, to begin to honestly consider the truth of the matter that Jesus came back the second time at the time Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed according to the Old Testament prophecies and according to the prophecies of Jesus Christ himself. Hopefully this evidence is compelling. Hopefully this evidence is helping you to begin to grasp the magnitude of what was really happening in 70 AD that has not been taught to the majority of Christians. So in about 5 minutes, I will begin part number 6 of the Jewish War series. But before that, Sherry has asked a question which I will answer very quickly. The Zealots, were they Jews? Absolutely, every one of them. The Zealots are the Jews. They were the Jewish rebels. Starting from the time Jesus was born, as I said, one of Jesus' own disciples was a zealot, Simeon the Zealot. They were rebels amongst the Jews. They were people who fashioned themselves like the Maccabees who had defeated the Greeks the previous century. So yes, they were Jews. And they were beasts. And they were not good beasts. So their beast mode was not like that other guy from Seattle, the football team. James Kirkland tells us the Zealots were independent. Yes, they were independence fighters. They were fighting for the freedom of Israel, but they were not fighting for the freedom of Israel by God's hand. They were using their own means. They were very wicked men. So anyway, let's move on to the next one. Let's see you in the next session. I am going to continue because I do want to come to the end of these things, and I think that this evidence is very important to be recorded so that Christians can somehow begin to understand how Matthew 24 was fulfilled. So please share this video with others in your circles, and may the Lord bless you. I know, Brother Nathan, you told us you'll only be here up to 4 p.m. It's now 3:45. So until I see you the next time, Nathan, you continue to be blessed, and the rest of you will see you shortly.